A small boat is moving over black water, somewhere in the warm dark of an early night, its reed hull caulked with bitumen, its one mast holding a sail that barely fills. Under the keel, there is nothing anyone aboard can see. Into that nothing, the sea monsters of world mythology begin, set there by nearly every seafaring people that has ever gone out on open water, named in the ordinary blindness of a hull over deep water. Why has almost every people that went out on water set something enormous beneath it? And what were they actually naming down there? A predator, a warning, a misread carcass, or the darkness itself? If these ancient stories help you rest, subscribe so the next story can find you at bedtime. We will go slowly toward an answer, and the road runs a long way, from the oldest carved fights, where a Sumerian god stands over a serpent with 7 heads, out to the Babylonian mother of the waters, whose body became a sky. Then to a servant serpent named in the broken tablets of Ugarit, and to the Leviathan that the Hebrew scriptures inherited from that lineage. Then to a Greek strait so narrow that 2 separate dangers sat within an arrow's range of one another, and to a shore where a young man met a beast that had been sent by a god. Then north to the Norwegian kraken and the crooked tree word it was named after, and at the end, to the things that were actually dragged up onto beaches in later centuries, laid out on the sand, photographed, and given ordinary names. Let your shoulders go heavy. There is nothing here that needs your effort. Back to the boat. The rope creaks where it holds the yard. The bitumen smells faintly of tar in the heat that the day left behind, and the reeds work against one another with a sound like slow breathing. A man leans on the steering oar and watches the horizon for the low, dark line of the coast, because the coast is the only page he can read. Everything below him is closed. He can put his hand into the water and feel it, cool and heavy and alive with movement, and he can pull that hand back out again, knowing nothing at all about what the water contains, a fathom beneath his palm. Sailors have always lived on the exact skin of an enormous unlit room. That is not a figure of speech, and it is the first thing to understand about all the stories that follow. Sunlight illuminates only the upper layers of the sea. The major part of the ocean, nearly all of it, by volume, exists in permanent darkness, and it did so long before anyone invented a name for what might be swimming there. The dark came first. The monster was set into it afterwards. Descend, then, from the hull, not far and not quickly. The sea holds 1,335,000,000 cubic kilometers of water, which is about 97.2% of all the water this planet is known to possess. It covers roughly 71% of the surface. Another 2.15% is frozen, the sea ice on the Arctic Ocean, the cap over Antarctica and its adjacent seas, the glaciers and the surface deposits scattered around the world. Everything else, all the rivers and rainfall and groundwater and cloud of a whole living planet, is the remaining fraction of a percent, moving through its stages of the water cycle or resting in reservoirs underground. Earth is the only known planet with seas of liquid water on its surface. Whatever else our world is, it is mostly this. And the light fails in an orderly sequence. Much of it is turned back at the surface before it ever enters, reflected away depending on the angle of the sun and the weather and the turbidity of the water. Of what does get in, red is absorbed in the top few meters, which is why the red things down there stop being red almost at once. Yellow and green reach further. Blue and violet may travel as deep as 1,000 meters, and then even they are gone. Below about 200 meters, there is not enough light for photosynthesis, so that thin upper band is the only part of the whole sea where a plant can grow. Beneath it lies the great majority of the water on this world, and none of it has ever grown a leaf. The cold is just as orderly. In the tropics, with the sun nearly overhead, the surface layers can climb past 30 degrees Celsius, warm enough to swim in without thinking. Near the poles, water in equilibrium with sea ice sits at about -2. But go down far enough anywhere on the globe, under the tropics, under the temperate seas, under the ice, and the deep water is between -2 and 5 degrees Celsius. The same cold everywhere. The surface has climates. The deep has only one. Then there is the salt, which is the quiet cruelty of the whole arrangement. The open ocean carries about 35 grams of dissolved solids in every liter, most of it sodium chloride, with magnesium and calcium and potassium, and a scatter of other elements in smaller and smaller amounts. Sodium and chloride together account for around 85% of what is in solution. A person adrift in that water is surrounded, in every direction, by more water than they could drink in 10,000 lifetimes, and cannot drink any of it, because the human kidney cannot produce urine as salty as seawater, so every mouthful costs more water than it gives. Endless drink, no drinking. The sea is generous with everything except the one thing a body immediately wants. So the setting was in place long before the stories were. Darkness, cold, salt, and volume. Life itself may have originated in the sea. All the major groups of animals are represented there, and many of the major groups of organisms evolved there. Whatever we are, we came up out of it, and then we built boats and went back out on top of it, and looked down, and had nothing to look at. People began going out very early, and the record of it is more detailed than you might expect. Humans have traveled the seas for as long as they have built sea-going craft. In Mesopotamia, they were using bitumen to caulk reed boats, that same tar-smelling seal on the hull we started with. And a little later, they were raising masted sails, which is the moment the wind stops being an obstacle and becomes an engine. By about 3,000 years before the Common Era, Austronesians on Taiwan had begun spreading into maritime Southeast Asia, island by island, over water that had no roads on it. Around 2750, before the Common Era, the Egyptian Hanu reached the Arabian Peninsula and the African coast. The Egyptians and the Phoenicians worked the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, learning their winds and their headlands and their sudden weathers. Then the Austronesian voyagers we call the Lapita peoples did something that still seems barely credible. They reached out from the Bismarck archipelago as far as Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and their descendants went on traveling thousands of miles between tiny islands on outrigger canoes, finding along the way Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and New Zealand. Not a coast-hugging trade, but open blue water for weeks, with the sky and the swell and the birds for instruments. In the first millennium before the Common Era, Phoenicians and Greeks planted colonies throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and the sea became a network of familiar destinations rather than a rim of unknown. Around 500 before the Common Era, the Carthaginian navigator Hanno left a detailed periplus, a written coasting account, harbour after harbour, of an Atlantic journey that reached at least Senegal and possibly as far as Mount Cameroon. These are people doing careful, practical, professional work. And yet the same tradition of sea writing preserves a line that has nothing practical about it at all. In the Ora Maritima, the late Latin poet Avianius relates the voyage of another Carthaginian, Himilco, and reports what was said of those far waters. There monsters of the deep, and beasts swim amid the slow and sluggishly crawling ships. Read it again in your mind. The ships are slow, the ships are crawling, and something is swimming among them. It is testimony of a kind, a sailor's report, folded into a poem, arriving to us second-hand across many centuries. It is exactly the sort of statement that opens a door, because it does not describe a creature at all. It only says, something is out there, moving more easily than we are, which raises the question of what we are actually saying when we say the word. Sea monsters, as the reference works define them, are beings from folklore believed to dwell in the sea and often imagined to be of immense size. Marine monsters take many forms: sea dragons, sea serpents, tentacled beasts. They can be slimy and scaly. They are very often pictured threatening ships or spouting jets of water. And then, immediately after the definition, the honest admission, the definition of a monster is subjective. There is no measuring instrument. The category has soft edges, and it has always had them, and some of the creatures inside it may well have been based on animals that turned out to be perfectly real: whales and the giant and colossal squids. The word itself is stranger and gentler than its reputation. Monster comes from the Latin monstrum, and monstrum descends ultimately from the verb moneo, to remind, to warn, to instruct, or to foretell. A monstrum was anything strange or singular, contrary to the usual course of nature, by which the gods gave notice of evil. It could mean a strange, unnatural, hideous person or animal or thing. It could also simply mean any monstrous or unusual thing, circumstance or adventure. So before the monster is a predator, it is a sign. It is not primarily something that eats you, it is something that means. Suetonius shows how wide that meaning could be. He describes a snake's absence of legs as monstrous, and a bird's ability to fly as monstrous, both, equally, being against nature. Neither is a threat, neither is even unusual to us. They are simply departures from the ordinary rule, and a departure from the ordinary rule was the whole content of the word. The darker sense arrived quickly enough. By Seneca's time, monstrum had extended into a philosophical meaning, a visual and horrific revelation of the truth. The thing that appears, and by appearing, discloses. Monsters predate written history. We have no first one, no origin, no earliest recorded specimen, only the fact that when writing appears, they are already there, fully formed, with names. The academic study of what a given society's monsters express is called monstraphy, and one of its clearest working principles comes from Tina Marie Boyer, a scholar of medieval German literature. Monsters do not emerge out of a cultural void. They have a literary and cultural heritage. Nothing swims up from nowhere. Each one is descended from an earlier one, or borrowed from a neighbor, or translated out of a language that had a different animal in mind. And these stories are myths in the scholarly sense, which is not the everyday sense at all. For scholars, myth is a genre of folklore consisting of narratives that play a fundamental role in a society, and the veracity of a piece of folklore is entirely irrelevant to whether it constitutes a myth. Truth is simply not the test. A myth is not a failed fact. It is a different kind of object. What kind, exactly, is still argued over, and the argument is worth hearing because none of the answers has won. The Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko offers a definition much quoted. A myth, he says, is a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods, as a result of which the world and nature and culture were created together with all their parts and given the order they still hold. A myth, in his phrasing, expresses and confirms a society's religious values and norms, provides a pattern of behavior to be imitated, testifies to the efficacy of ritual, and establishes the sanctity of cult. Professor José Manuel Losada frames it differently, as a functional, symbolic, and thematic narrative of one or several extraordinary events with a transcendent, sacred, and supernatural referent, one which lacks, in principle, historical testimony, and which refers to a cosmogony or an eschatology that is always, whether individual or collective, absolute. And in holistic myth research, the Assyriologist Annette Zegol and the classical philologist Christian Zegol propose that a myth is best defined as an Erzählstoff, a narrative material, which is polymorphic through its variants and, depending on the variant, layered. 3 definitions, 3 disciplines, no agreement. Hold that lightly as we go on, because the sea monster will turn out to be exactly this kind of object, polymorphic through its variants, layered, and never quite the same creature twice. The oldest images we can actually date are carved, not written. In Sumerian iconography of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the god Ninurta is shown overcoming a serpent with 7 heads. That is the earliest firm picture of the fight, a deity, a many-headed serpent, and the moment of mastery, pressed into stone and clay before anyone had told us in sentences what it meant. Later, on Syrian seals of the 18th to 16th centuries before the Common Era, another serpent dies. This one has a name, Têmtum, killed at the hands of Hadad. The seals are small, objects to be rolled across wet clay to seal a jar or a document, so the whole cosmic event is the size of a thumb, repeated wherever the seal was pressed. And the role that Têmtum plays in those images appears to prefigure the role that a later serpent, Lotan, would play in a tradition that grew up along the same coast. The pattern has a German name that scholars have used for over a century, Chaoskampf, the battle against chaos, also called the combat myth, a widespread motif in which a culture hero deity fights a chaos monster, and the monster very often has the form of a sea serpent or a dragon. Near Eastern religions commonly carried some version of it, a cosmic battle between a sea monster representing the forces of chaos and a creator god or hero who imposes order by force. Nicholas Wyatt puts the category this way: as a class of divine combat narratives with cosmogonic overtones, sometimes turned secondarily to other purposes, in which the hero god vanquishes a power or powers opposed to him, powers which generally dwell in or are identified with the sea and are presented as chaotic and desolatory forces. That is one definition among several, and here the honesty of the sources matters more than the tidiness. Scholars have long disagreed about how widely the word should reach. Some would confine it only to combats bound directly to the making of the world, the fight that produces a cosmos as its outcome. Others extend it further, gathering in every divine battle against a monstrous sea power, regardless of whether a world is built from the wreckage. A third school draws yet another boundary, separating the god who fights for his own people in a local war from the god who fights for the entire ordered structure of existence. So even the frame around these stories is contested, not broken, contested, which is a livelier thing. The fight is real, the images are datable, and what the fight is for remains open. Before we narrow down to the great cases, let the wider roll of names be said aloud, because the sea is crowded, and most of its inhabitants survive only as a line or two. There is the Aspidokelone, a giant turtle, or perhaps a whale, so large that it appeared to be an island, and lured sailors to their doom by seeming to be solid ground, a place to land, a place to rest, a fire lit on a back that had never been stone. There is the devil whale, a demonic whale the size of an island, which is the same enormity told with a different temper. There is Capricorn, the Babylonian sea-goat, which did not stay in the water at all, but was set among the figures of the zodiac, so that a creature half of the sea now rises and sets with the year. In Celtic tradition there is the Curruid, remembered chiefly for what was made from it, the gay bulg, a weapon whose substance came from the creature's bone. The monster survives as material, as a thing another story needed. And then, on the southeastern coast of Alaska, there is Gunakadate. In Tlingit legend, Gunakadate is a sea monster who came to a village in crisis, a people starving in the home they had made for themselves, and who brought them prosperity and good luck. Not slain, not resisted, not a chaos to be pushed back so that order could stand. A monster who arrives, and after whose arrival there is food. Keep that one where you can feel it. Everything ahead of us is going to be full of gods with weapons and serpents with many heads, and it would be easy to conclude that a great shape in the water always means a threat coming toward a village. Gunakadate is the quiet correction sitting under all of it, the reminder that the enormous thing beneath a hull was never obliged to be an enemy, and that some people, looking down into the same darkness, saw a giver. There is a line at the head of a Babylonian tablet that begins by taking things away. When on high, it says, "The heavens did not yet exist, nor the earth below, no sky, no ground, no horizon between them, and in that absence, two waters, already there, already touching. Apsû, the subterranean ocean, the water that lies under everything, called the first, the begetter, and Tiamat, the overground sea, she who bore them all. The tablet describes them mixing their waters, and that is the whole of the world at that moment, fresh below, salt above, and no boundary drawn between the two." The poem is called the Enuma Elish, which is not really a title at all, but its opening words, "when on high" or "when above." It was the ordinary practice of that scribal world to name a work by the sound it begins with, the way you might name a song by its first phrase. It was written in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, in Lower Mesopotamia, in the Babylonian variety of the Akkadian language, pressed into clay in wedge-shaped strokes by people who lived within reach of the water it describes. Tiamat is called the shining personification of the sea. She carries another name too, Hubur, which translates as Mother Watercourse, she who formed all things. Hold on to that phrase for a moment, because a great deal of what comes later depends on it. Before she is anything else in this story, she is the one who forms, the maker, not the thing to be unmade. And what is remarkable about this opening, what is easy to miss if you have only heard the ending, is how peaceful it is. There is no struggle in the mingling, nothing is fighting. Two bodies of water lie against each other in the dark and produce, without effort, everything that follows. If you were told this myth begins in chaos, the tablet itself disagrees. It begins in something much closer to rest. The archaeologist Harriet Crawford has pointed out that this mixing of waters is not an abstraction at all. It is a natural feature of the Middle Persian Gulf, where fresh water from the Arabian aquifer rises and mingles with the salt water of the sea. Sailors know these places. The water changes character without changing color, a difference you feel more than see, a coolness threading up through the warm, a taste that alters at the lips. People who lived beside such a place would have had no need to imagine the primeval scene. They could put a hand into it. So the world begins as a slow confluence in the dark, and out of that confluence the generations come. First Lahmu and Lahamu, whose name means hairy. It is a strange, homely word to find at the root of the cosmos, and stranger still that the same title was given to the gatekeepers at Enki's Eengura temple in the city of Eridu, figures standing at a doorway, in a real town, in the sunlight, with a name borrowed from the second thing that ever existed. Myth and masonry, sharing a vocabulary. Lahmu and Lahamu became the parents of the ends of things. Anshar, from Anshar, heaven totality, the far edge of the sky, and Kishar, earth's ends, the far edge of the ground. The two of them were understood to meet at the horizon, which is exactly what the horizon is if you stand on a flat shore and watch, the place where the totality of the sky and the ends of the earth come together in a single thin line. The genealogy is doing geography. It is naming what anyone standing at the water's edge can see. And from Anshar and Kishar came Anu, who is heaven, and Ki, who is earth. 4 generations, and the shape of the world is finished. Sky above, ground below, the seam between them, the waters underneath and around. Then the gods went on reproducing. The tablet does not slow down to name them all. It says only that they multiplied into a new mass of divine children, young, numerous, and loud. Here is where the whole cosmos turns, and it turns on nothing grand at all. Not a betrayal, not a prophecy, noise. The children were noisy. Apsû, the deep water beneath, could not rest for the sound of them. That is the hinge. A creation epic that has just built the horizon out of 2 personified edges now pivots on a complaint that any household in any century would recognize. Someone downstairs cannot sleep, and the young ones will not be quiet. The vastest story these people had comes to its crisis through the most ordinary irritation there is. Driven to violence by that noise, Apsû resolved to destroy them. The plan was not idle. Enki understood it correctly, and understood it in time, that Apsû, the water below, meant to murder the younger deities and have his silence back. And so Apsû was killed. The poem does not linger over it, and neither will we. What matters is the consequence, which arrives immediately and from the direction the story had not been watching. Tiamat had not planned this. She had not schemed, had not been consulted, had not raised a hand. She learned that her children had killed the one she had lain beside since before there was a sky to lie under, and she went to war against them. That is the moment. Not a monster waking, a mother, enraged, choosing battle, and chaos entering a story that did not begin in it. She took a new consort, Chingu, and she gave him the Tablet of Destinies. That object is worth understanding plainly, because it is the political heart of the quarrel. The Tablet of Destinies represents legitimate divine rulership. It is the warrant. Whoever holds it holds the right to decree. By handing it to Chingu, Tiamat is not merely arming a champion, she is declaring that the authority to govern the cosmos has changed hands, and that it now sits on her side of the water. Then she made her army. She conjured forth monsters, a series of them, brought out of herself as her weapons, and the tablet gives one detail about their making that has outlived everything else said of them. She filled their bodies with poison instead of blood. Not blood mixed with poison. Not blood turned bad. Poison in the place where blood should be, all the way through, as a design. It is a chilling little phrase, and it is chilling precisely because it is so anatomical. Something was supposed to be in there, and something else is. If you are drifting a little by now, that is welcome. The story will hold its shape without you watching it closely. What follows is the part everyone remembers, and it is also the part where the poem becomes unlike every other text of its kind. Against Tiamat's assembled forces, the younger gods put forward a champion of their own, Enki's son, the storm god Marduk. Storm against sea, weather against water. He defeated her. And then he did the thing that makes this epic singular. He did not seal her away, or bind her, or drive her to the edge of the map. He dismembered her, and from the parts of her body, he constructed the elements of the cosmos. The heavens and the earth were built out of the sea. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. The sky over Babylon, the ground under Babylon. In this account, they are her. Not made in her memory, not made in her image, made of her. Every person who told this story afterwards was living inside the body of the one who lost. Scholars have made a great deal of this, and rightly, because of a structural fact. The Enuma Elish is the only surviving text from the ancient Near East that places a cosmic battle inside a creation narrative. There are other combats in other traditions, gods against sea powers, heroes against serpents, and they are many. But in the surviving material, the fight and the making of the world are joined in this one poem alone. Elsewhere the battle happens, and the world is not built from it. Here the corpse becomes the architecture. The German word attached to this pattern is Chaoskampf. The battle against chaos. It was first used with respect to the destruction of Tiamat in this very poem, and only afterwards stretched outward to cover combats across half the ancient world, which means, oddly, that the whole category was named after its least typical member. Modern scholarship has not been comfortable with the term ever since. It is described as lacking any consistent definition across studies. Some prefer to reserve it strictly for cosmic battles that end in creation and to use Theomachy, a fight between gods for everything else. A word coined for one tablet has been asked to carry an entire continent of stories and its strains, which leaves the question the poem never quite answers on its own terms. What, in the end, was she? The text is unusually generous with her body and unusually confusing. It gives her a tail, a thigh, lower parts that shake together, a belly, an udder, ribs, a neck, a head, a skull, eyes, nostrils, a mouth, lips. It goes inward as well, her insides, which may be entrails, her heart, her arteries, her blood. It also gives her breasts. So within a single figure, you have anthropomorphic features, the breasts, the human face parts, set directly beside theriomorphic ones, the tail, the udder, something with a woman's chest and a beast's hindquarters, or perhaps two overlapping ways of speaking about a body that was never meant to resolve into one picture. She is very often called a dragon. The Assyriologist Alexander Heidel recognized long ago that a dragon form cannot be imputed to Tiamat with certainty. The text does not describe wings, does not describe scales, does not hand you the creature the later illustrations hand you. She is still routinely called a monster, and that identification has been credibly challenged. Before she is the mother of monsters, she is just as clearly portrayed as the mother of all the gods, and that is not a softening after the fact. It is what the opening of the poem plainly says. So there are, at minimum, two Tiamats sharing one name, and the poem seems content with both. Her name has been worked over just as hard. Thorkild Jacobson and Walter Burkert both argue for a connection between Tiamat and the Akkadian word for sea, Têmtum, following an earlier form, Têmtum. If they are right, her name is barely a name. It is the word for what she is, given a shape and a voice. Burkert carries the thread further still and makes a linguistic connection to Tethys, the Greek sea figure, though that is his argument rather than a settled result. There is a related thought about the copyists, that in some secondary translations, the proper name, Tiamat, was simply dropped because scribes substituted the ordinary word, Têmtum. See, the two having become essentially the same through association. Picture that as a small human event, a person at a writing surface, deciding that the goddess and the water are close enough to be spelled the same way. The distinction between a deity and a substance, quietly erased by a copyist's convenience. Behind her, there may be something older again. It has been suggested, hedged, and hedged twice over, so take it as a possibility rather than a finding, that Tiamat may have begun as part of the cult of Namu, a female principle of watery creative force, with equally strong connections to the underworld, a cult thought to predate the appearance of Ea Enki. If so, then the figure Marduk cuts apart in the poem is the surviving trace of something that was worshipped before the poem's own gods arrived. It is also thought, more broadly, that female deities in Mesopotamia are older than the male ones. And there is one further claim, which travels further than any of the others. Tiamat has been claimed to be cognate with the Northwest Semitic word, Tehom. The deeps, the abyss, the word that appears in the Hebrew creation narrative, where darkness lies upon the face of the deep. A claim, stated as a claim. Some scholars press it hard, others reject the whole association, arguing that the terms in that opening verse are not semantically related to chaos at all, and that in the Babylonian account, the entire cosmos is unformed, whereas in the Hebrew one, at most, the earth is. The dispute has never closed. What survives all of it is smaller and steadier than any of the arguments. Two waters lying against each other in the dark, mixing without struggle, in the manner of a real gulf where the aquifer rises into the salt. A house grown too loud, a death that was not planned by the one who avenged it, and afterwards, a sky. The tablets do not tell you how to feel about her. They give you her name, her waters, her children, her anger, and then the inventory of her body distributed across the world. And they leave the question of what she was standing open, the way a door left ajar in a warm room stays open all night, without anyone deciding it should. On the Syrian coast, in a city called Ugarit, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into damp clay and left them to harden in the shade. The sea was close enough to be heard from the courtyards. Ships came in from Cyprus and from Egypt. The harbour smelled of pitch and salt and drying fish. And in the tablets those scribes made, among lists of grain and copper and the names of kings, there survives a cycle of poems about the god Baal, Hadad, the storm, and about the sea, which in that language was not merely water, but a person with a name, Yamu, the sea, a god in his own right, with a household and a temper and a claim on the divine assembly. Yamu did not go about his business alone. He had servants, and among them was a creature whose name in Ugaritic is written Lotan. Hold that name a moment, because it is going to travel a very long way. Lotan is the older form of a word you almost certainly know in another shape, and the whole northern half of this story is the account of how one syllable at a time changed a monster's nationality. What the tablets say about him is less than we would like. Most scholars agree that Lotan is the one called Beten-Brach, the fugitive serpent, sometimes rendered the fleeing serpent, a name that carries motion in it, a body already sliding away from whoever is reaching for it. That much is broadly settled. After that, the ground softens. There are two further epithets in the same poetic neighborhood. B-tune, Kulton. The wriggling or twisting serpent, and Schlit Dejbeterashm, the mighty one with 7 heads. Whether those belong to Lotan as well, or to some other creature entirely, is not something the tablets will tell us. The reason is simple and physical. The clay is broken. There are gaps in the account, places where the surface has flaked, where a line runs into blankness, where the object of a verb has crumbled and left the verb standing alone. And Yamu had more than one monster at his disposal. One of the others is called Tunanu, a name that will matter again shortly, since it is the same word that appears in Hebrew as Tannin. So when the poem describes a wriggling thing or a 7-headed thing, we cannot always say which servant of the sea is being described. The epithets float loose between them, attached to nobody with certainty. What the cycle does say clearly is that Hadad defeated him. The storm against the sea, the god of rain and thunder, against the god of the salt water and his household of serpents, and the serpent goes down. This was not the first time such an image had been cut into hard material in that part of the world. That iconography had already fixed the essential shape long before the Ugaritic scribes reached for their tools. A storm god, a serpent, a victory, pressed into the face of a seal too small to hold anything but the outline of the event. The tradition the Ugaritic cycle was drawing on was therefore not young. Lotan stepped into a role that Têmtum had already defined, and the victory that Hadad claims in the Ugaritic poems is a repetition of a much older triumph. The pattern was already old when the scribes of Ugarit received it. They were copying a shape. And here a small, careful distinction is worth carrying with you, because it quietly governs everything that follows. There is a scholarly habit of calling every such episode a battle against chaos, a cosmic fight in which a hero god defeats a sea monster and by that victory establishes the world. But at least one strand of scholarship declines to file the Baal cycle under that heading, and the reason is precise. Nothing is made from Yam's body. No heavens are stretched out, no earth laid down. The storm wins, and the world is simply the world it already was, unchanged in its dimensions, redistributed only in its authorities. The Baal cycle does not set out to explain why anything exists. It sets out to explain who governs what already does, which is a narrower and more particular kind of power. So the Serpent of Ugarit is defeated, and the tablets go into the ground with the city, and several centuries pass. When the creature surfaces again, it surfaces in Hebrew, and its name has shifted its vowels. Leviathan. He appears 6 times in the Tanakh. 6, a small number for a creature of such weight, and the smallness is part of the effect. He is never explained, never introduced. The text assumes you already know him. One of those 6 appearances is not a mention but a portrait. The whole of Job, chapter 41, verses 1 through 34, is given over to him, and it is God who is speaking. It is a description delivered as a challenge, and its subject is a creature the speaker made and the listener cannot touch. There is his fire-breathing, flame going out of his mouth, the language of a furnace given a body. There are his scales, described as impenetrable, shut up together as with a close seal, so that no blade finds a seam. And beneath both details, there is the quality the chapter really exists to establish, which is simply that he cannot be beaten, not by a hook, not by a spear, not by any arrangement of human courage. One line stands at the center of it. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him? The hope of catching him is empty, and more than that, the mere sight of the animal is enough to put a man on the ground. No contact is required. Terror precedes the encounter and does the work of it. The Leviathan of Job is a reflection of the older Canaanite Lotan, the primeval monster defeated by the god Baal-Hadad. The same creature, arriving in a different language and inside a different theology. In Ugarit, He belonged to the sea and was killed by the storm. In Job, he belongs to God, who made him and describes him with something close to fondness. The terrible thing, catalogued admiringly by the one who owns it. The monster did not change, its address changed. The genealogy of these names stretches far enough back that the thread of it can be held loosely. What matters now is the creature waiting at the end of that line, the same shape, the same coils, arriving in a different language. Because Leviathan does not settle into a single tone, he is one creature with a set of incompatible moods, depending on which page you open. In Psalm 104, God is praised for having made all things, the earth, the waters, the beasts, the ships that go upon the sea, and Leviathan is simply on the list. Not an enemy, not chaos, an item in an inventory of good work, made to play in the water like anything else that was made. Turn to Isaiah, chapter 27, verse 1, and the mood has entirely reversed. There Leviathan is called the tortuous serpent, the twisted one, and he is to be killed, not now, but at the end of time, with a sword that is prepared and waiting. He is on a schedule. Whatever he is, the world is not finished until he is dealt with. He is referred to again in the book of Enoch, and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible his name does something stranger still. It becomes a way of speaking about a powerful enemy, notably Babylon. The empire is named after the sea monster, a political fact wearing a mythological skin, so that the thing crushing your nation and the thing lying under the water become, for the length of a sentence, the same creature. Out of these strands, the later tradition assembles a figure who is chaos itself, given a body, a creature said to wait for the damned and to eat them when their lives are over, and who is, in the end, annihilated, not tamed, not bound, ended. Two further readings are worth attaching to somebody's name rather than stating flatly. Christian theologians identified Leviathan with the demon of the deadly sin of envy, the appetite that swallows what it cannot be. And according to the Ophite diagrams, Leviathan encapsulates the space of the material world, not a beast in the sea, but a circle drawn around everything, with all of creation inside the coil. The serpent stops being an inhabitant of the world and becomes its boundary. Now, alongside him, there is a whole neighborhood of monsters that will not stay separate from one another, and the confusion is genuinely ancient rather than a modern muddle. The Tanninim, the Hebrew plural, that final syllable marking more than one, appear across an unusually wide spread of books: Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Job, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. 8 books, different centuries, different concerns, and the same word surfacing in all of them like a shape that keeps passing under a boat. Their most surprising appearance is the earliest one. The Tanninim are explicitly listed among the creatures God made on the 5th day of the Genesis creation narrative, not defeated on the 5th day, made. They are part of the ordinary furniture of a finished world, ranked with the fish and the birds. The King James translators rendered them there as great whales, which is a decision worth hearing as a decision, a monster turned, by an English choice, into an animal. Yet the same word will not stay domesticated. In the Apocalypse of Isaiah, the Tannin is listed among the sea beasts to be slain by Yahweh on that day, and the King James Version, faced with the identical Hebrew word, renders it there as the dragon. One word, two translations, at opposite ends of the same book. A creature made on the fifth day, and a creature to be killed at the last. The English preserves the contradiction perfectly by refusing to translate it consistently. In Jewish tradition, Tannin is sometimes conflated with the related sea monsters, Leviathan and Rahab, three names sliding across one another, so that a passage about one can be read as a passage about any. And along with Rahab, the name Tannin was applied to ancient Egypt after the Exodus to Canaan. A monster's name becomes a nation's name. The empire you fled from is the serpent in the water. The water it lived in was the water you walked through. Whatever else these creatures are, they are also a way of speaking about the thing that once held you and no longer can. Which brings the whole matter to a room full of scholars arguing about a word, and this too is part of the story rather than a footnote to it, because for this creature, the disagreement is most of the surviving evidence. Start with the name itself. Gesenius, among others, argued that Leviathan derives from the root wh, meaning to twine, to join, with an adjectival ending attached, giving a literal sense of wreathed or twisted in folds, a name that is simply a description of a coil. It fits the tortuous serpent of Isaiah so neatly that it is easy to stop there. Others decline to stop there. Leskian and other philologists held that the word is not native Hebrew at all, but a foreign loanword, arriving from elsewhere with its meaning already sealed inside it. A third school takes it as neither description nor loan, but a proper noun, a name and nothing more, the way a person's name is not an argument about the person. And Georg Lorenz Bauer proposed a compound reading, two elements joined, giving wreath of serpent. The difficulty with the first and most attractive reading is admitted openly. That adjectival suffix, in the precise form required, is otherwise unattested, except perhaps in Nehushtan, the name of the bronze serpent, and Nehushtan's own etymology is unknown, so the one piece of supporting evidence is itself unexplained. Then there is a consonant, the letter tav, that would still require accounting for. The ordinary feminine singular adjective built on that pattern would have come out as Livion, and it did not. So the elegant derivation leans on a parallel that cannot stand and leaves a letter unexplained. That is the honest state of it. The creature's name is not securely translatable. Behind that small quarrel sits a much larger one, and it opens in 1895 with a German work by Hermann Gunkel, whose title translates as Creation and Chaos in Primeval Time and End Time. Since Gunkel, historians of biblical studies have connected the theme of chaos in the older Babylonian cosmology, and now in other cognate narratives from across the ancient Near East, with the creation narrative in Genesis. One book and a whole century of reading followed it. John D. Levinson discussed the process as a demythologization, accounts in which serpent combat is a divine creative act, being retold in later periods, their edges filed down, until they are reworked into the creation story of Genesis 1, where the monster has become a made thing on the fifth day rather than an opponent. John Day made a different case, arguing from Ugaritic evidence and cognate words that Yahweh's conquest over Leviathan is primarily Canaanite in origin and not Babylonian at all, which is to say, the road runs from the broken tablets of that coastal city, not from the river valleys further east. And the flat modern statement, after all of it, is that the presence of a battle against chaos in the biblical tradition is now contentious. Some scholars reject the association entirely on two grounds: that the terms in Genesis 1-2 are not semantically related to chaos in the first place, and that in the Babylonian and other traditions the entire cosmos is chaotic, whereas in Genesis, at most, the earth is. Those terms in Genesis 1-2 are Tohu wa Bohu, and above them lies Choshek, translated from the Hebrew as darkness or confusion. Tohu wa Bohu may refer to a state of non-being before anything was, or to a formless state, matter without shape yet. It has also been likened to a watery chaos, over whose face the Spirit of God is moving. 3 readings, all still in play, all resting on 2 words. So the serpent's name will not resolve, the creature will not stay one creature, and the darkness above the water will not settle into a single meaning. The tablets are broken where the answer would be, and there is something restful in that, once you stop resisting it. These are stories that survived, not by being certain, but by being copied, and argued over, and copied again. Westward now, into a bright and narrow water, where the danger is not one thing but 2, and the 2 are set facing each other across a channel so slender that a ship cannot avoid one without leaning toward the other. On the one side stands a crag, and in the crag a monster who eats men. Her name is Scylla. On the other side, opposite her, lies the sea-swallowing thing called Charybdis, whose mouth forms a whirlpool, and whose whirlpool draws down any vessel that comes near it, hull and mast and cargo, beneath the ocean. Neither of them chases, neither of them ranges the open water hunting for sails. They simply hold their positions, one to the left and one to the right, and wait for the sea lane to bring the ships to them. The distance between those 2 sides is the whole cruelty of the arrangement. The sources give it plainly. The 2 shores lie within an arrow's range of each other. Not a day's sailing, not an hour's. The span a decent bowman could cross with a single shot. So a helmsman who sees the water beginning to turn on the Charybdis side, that slow dimpling in the surface that becomes a slope and then a funnel, will do what any sane man does. He will lean his steering oar and take his ship away from the swirl. And in taking his ship away from the swirl, he brings it under the crag. And under the crag is Scylla. Should he fear the crag instead and stand off from it, he places his keel over the mouth that swallows. There is no middle water. That is the geometry the myth is built on, and it is a colder idea than either creature alone. A monster you can flee is a problem of speed. Two monsters set an arrow's flight apart are a problem of arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care how fast you row. Where this channel lies, the oldest telling does not say. Homer gives no coast, no landmark, no name of any nearby country. The strait floats free in the poem, the way places do in dreams, defined entirely by its two occupants and by the impossible narrowness between them. Later hands will pin it to a map, and we shall come to that in a while, because the pinning is a story of its own. For the moment, let the channel stay where the poem leaves it, somewhere out in the salt, unlocated, waiting. Into that unlocated water comes a ship, and the first man ever to describe Scylla is describing her from its deck. She is first attested in the Odyssey, in the 12th book, and she arrives there not as a surprise but as a briefing. Before Odysseus sails, Circe tells him what is coming. She does not soften it. She lays out the choice as a merchant lays out weights. Keep to Scylla's crag, sail past her, go at your utmost speed. Better by far, she says, to lose 6 men and keep your ship than to lose your entire crew. Because Charybdis, if the ship drifts into her, does not take a portion, she takes the whole. That counsel, offered without ceremony or comfort, amounts to a kind of triage between two losses. It is not heroic advice. There is no clever trick in it, no herb, no charm, no name to shout that will make the water flat. It is a calculation, offered by a goddess to a captain, about which of 2 losses he would rather carry home, 6 men, or all of them, and Odysseus accepts the calculation. Circe gives him one other instruction, and it is a strange, tender, almost domestic one. Call upon Crataeis, she says, Scylla's mother, a river nymph, and ask her to keep her daughter from pouncing more than once, not to stop her, not to bind her, only to hold her to a single lunge. Even the remedy offered by a divine advisor is a matter of limiting the toll, not lifting it. The mother of the monster is asked, politely, for restraint. And then there is the detail that has kept readers uneasy for as long as the poem has been read. Odysseus never told the rest of the crew. He knew, as they bent to their oars, what the shorter route cost. He knew the number. He knew that 6 of the men whose shoulders he could see working in front of him were the price of the ship, and he did not tell them which route he had chosen or why. He gave them the reason to row and kept the reckoning to himself. The passage itself, when it comes, is over quickly, and the poem's restraint is the thing to notice. Odysseus navigates the strait successfully. That much is simply true, and it is why we have the story at all. But at the moment of passing, the ship's whole attention goes to the wrong side. Charybdis is the spectacle. Charybdis is the water going wrong in a way no sailor has words for, a mouth opening in a surface that should have no mouth, and every eye aboard turns to it. Men look at the thing that would kill them all, and while they are looking, the thing that will kill 6 of them comes down from the rock behind them. She takes them off the deck, 6 of them, plucked away and devoured alive. The poem does not linger over it, and neither shall we. The chronicle records the number and moves the ship along. What stays with a reader is not gore, but the shape of the loss. That the men were lost while everyone was watching the other danger, which is how most losses in most lives actually happen. The ship sails on. Scylla remains on her crag. Nothing is avenged, and nothing is resolved, and the Odyssey does not come back for her. Centuries do, though, because a monster who exists only as a hazard in a strait eventually acquires something the oldest telling never gave her, a before. The later tradition insists that Scylla was not always this. It gives her a face. A Byzantine encyclopedia, the Suda, sets down her appearance with the flat precision of a catalogue entry, the look of a beautiful woman down to the eyes, and then 6 dog heads on each side of her, and beneath all of that, a serpent's body, beauty at the top, kept intact, as though whatever happened to her began below the eyes and worked downward. Whoever wrote that description understood something about horror. It is worse when the human part is still recognizable. And so the question that the later poets could not leave alone. If she was once beautiful, who changed her and why? 3 answers survive, and they will not be reconciled. In the version recorded by John Setsis and by Servius, in his commentary on the Aeneid, Scylla was a naiad, a freshwater nymph, and Poseidon claimed her. That claim is her whole offense. She does nothing at all. The Nereid Amphitrite, jealous, went to the spring where Scylla was accustomed to bathe, and poisoned the water there. Fresh water, inland, a quiet pool that a girl visited by habit. She stepped into it as she had 100 times before, and stepped out as something else. In the version Hyginus records in his Fabulae, the water is not fresh but salt, and the jealous party is not Amphitrite but Circe, the same Circe who will later advise a captain how to sail past the result of her own work. The rivalry is over Glaucus, who loved Scylla and whom Circe loved. While Scylla was bathing in the sea, Circe poured a baleful potion into it. Out of Scylla's thighs sprang 6 dog forms. In that shape, Hyginus says, she attacked the ship of Odysseus and robbed him of his companions. In Ovid's telling, the sequence is longer and sadder, and the water changes again. Glaucus here is a fisherman who became a sea god, and his new form is a fish's form, and Scylla is repulsed by it. She flees him up onto a promontory, a spur of high rock where the sea cannot reach and he cannot follow. So Glaucus goes to Circe the enchantress to beg for a potion that will win the girl's affection, and Circe, hearing him praise another woman, falls in love with him herself. Meeting with no success, she turns her whole jealousy on her rival. She prepares a vial of poison, and she pours it into the sea pool where Scylla regularly bathed. And Ovid adds the detail that no other version has, the one that makes the whole tradition ache. The transformation made Scylla a thing of terror even to herself. 3 accounts then, and every load-bearing element differs. The agent differs, Amphitrite in one, Circe in the other 2. The motive differs, a sea god's unwanted attention in one, a fisherman's misdirected love in the others. Even the water differs, a freshwater spring, the open sea, a pool. What the 3 hold in common is only the shape of the thing. Someone poisoned water that a woman was in the habit of entering, and the woman who came out of it was the creature on the crag. If you were hoping the disagreement stops there, it does not. It widens, and it widens most spectacularly at the question of who her parents were. Homer names her mother Crateis. Ovid names Crateis too, and so does Apollodorus, and so does Servius, and so does an anonymous scholiast writing on Plato. 5 sources, 1 mother, which sounds like agreement, until you notice that neither Homer nor Ovid names a father at all. The oldest and the most beautiful of the tellings simply leave the space blank. Others hurried to fill it. Apollodorus offers a father who is either Trienus, a name most scholars take to be a copyist's corruption of Triton, or else Phorcus, a variant of Phorkys. The scholiast on Plato, perhaps following Apollodorus, gives Tyrrhenus or Phorcus. Eustathius, annotating the Odyssey at line 1285, gives Triton, or else he says, the parents were Poseidon and Crateis together. The Hesiodic poem, known as the Megalai Ehoi, drops Crateis entirely and makes the parents Hecate and Phorbus. Acusilaus makes them Hecate and Phorkys, and the Scholia on that same Odyssey line agree with him. Then Apollonius of Rhodes attempts a repair. Perhaps trying to reconcile the accounts, he proposes that Crateis was simply another name for Hecate, one goddess with 2 names, and the contradiction dissolves. Semos of Delos will have none of it. For him, Crateis is the daughter of Hecate and Triton, and she bore Scylla by Deimos. Stesichorus, alone among them all, names the mother Lamia, and Hyginus abandons the whole family and assigns Scylla to Typhon and Echidna, the standard breeding pair of Greek monstrosity, as though the question were merely one of category. 12 authorities, more or less, and no parents. Notice what this actually is. It is not a gap in our knowledge that better manuscripts would close. It is the myth's surviving form. Scylla comes down to us chiefly as a disagreement, a name that a dozen careful men could not attach to a lineage, each of them writing in good faith, each of them certain enough to commit it to a scroll. And there is a lovely knot inside the disagreement. In one strand of the tradition, Phorcys is called her father. In Homer, Circe calls Crateis her mother. Yet Circe, in 2 of the 3 transformation stories, is not her relative at all, but the one who poured the poison. The same handful of divine names keeps circulating through her story in different roles, parent here, destroyer there, as though the tradition were shuffling a small deck and dealing her a different family each time. Her ending is dealt twice as well, and the two endings cannot occupy one timeline without somebody saying so out loud. In Homer she survives. The ship passes, the 6 men are gone, and Scylla is still in her rock when the poem leaves the strait. Nothing in the Odyssey removes her, but a late Greek myth, recorded in Eustathius's commentary and again in Tsetzes, has Heracles come upon her during a journey to Sicily and kill her. That is the whole of it, told with the brevity that late compilers reserve for things everyone is assumed to know. Heracles passes, Scylla is slain, and then the sea god Phorcys, here called her father, comes to the body and applies flaming torches to it, and by that fire restores her to life. Torches, not a potion, not a prayer, not the intercession of a greater god. Fire brought down to the water's edge and held against her, and she rises. Whatever else that story is, it is an admission by the tradition that Scylla cannot stay dead, because the strait still needs her. A hazard that has been removed from a shipping lane is a hazard that must be put back, which leaves only the last thing that happened to her, and it happened long after every poet who described her was in his grave. She was given an address. Homer's channel, remember, was nowhere. It had 2 sides and no country. But in the 3rd book of Virgil's Aeneid, the strait where Scylla dwells is identified with the Strait of Messina, the real, chartable, wind-scoured water between Calabria in the south of Italy and the island of Sicily. Suddenly the arrow's range has coordinates. Sailors can point at it. Merchants can price a cargo passing through it. A monster who lived in a poem now lives in a place that appears on the sailing routes of an actual empire, and the ships going by can look up at the cliffs on the Calabrian side and know whose they are. The naming went one step further still. On that Calabrian coast stands a town called Scylla, which takes its name from her, and which is said to be the home of the nymph, not the monster, the nymph, the woman from before the poisoned water. Fishermen's houses stacked up a rock face, boats drawn up on the shingle, ordinary evenings and ordinary suppers, all of it carrying her name and quietly preferring her earlier self. Consider what that sequence does, laid end to end. A hazard becomes a creature. The creature becomes a woman who was wronged. The woman acquires a dozen incompatible mothers and no reliable father. She is killed and burned back into life by torchlight. And then, centuries after any of it was sung, she is handed a stretch of coastline and a town with a harbor, so that a monster whose birth no one could agree on ends up with the one thing the poem never gave her, a fixed place to be found. The channel is quiet now, in the way that old water gets quiet once the ships that feared it have all long since docked. The crag is still there. The current still turns where it always turned. And somewhere, in the long argument between 12 authorities, a nymph steps into a pool she has entered 100 times, not yet knowing that this is the evening the story begins. The boast was made indoors, in a palace on the coast of Ethiopia, and it cost almost nothing to say. Queen Cassiopeia said that she and her daughter Andromeda were more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea's own daughters, the ones who ride its swells and are praised in its own language. It is the kind of sentence a person says in a warm room, pleased with the evening. The sea heard it anyway. Poseidon's wrath followed, and what he sent was not a storm, not a failed harvest, but a body, a Kêtos, a sea monster, turned loose against the coastline of that kingdom. The Greek word behind it is Kêtos, and it is worth having the word itself before the creature, because the word is wider than any picture of it. In ancient Greek, Kêtos, plural, kete, or kateia, denoted any huge sea monster at all, not a species, not a named individual, a size and a location, and the rest left open. Latinized it becomes Cetus, plural, seti, or sete. The name of the goddess Ceto is derived from that same word, so that one of the sea's own deities carries, as her name, the ordinary Greek for enormous thing in the water. When a Greek said Kêtos, he was not identifying an animal. He was admitting he had seen something large and had no better term. So the thing that came against Ethiopia arrived already unnamed in a precise way. King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia did what rulers did when the sea turned against a coast. They consulted a wise oracle, and the answer came back with the awful simplicity that oracles have. Sacrifice Andromeda to the Cetus, not appease it, not fight it. Give it the daughter whose beauty had been placed above the Nereids in a sentence that could not now be unsaid. They obeyed. Andromeda was chained to a rock near the ocean so that the Cetus could devour her. Hold the picture for a moment, because everything that follows in this part of the story hangs on it. A girl fixed to stone at the edge of the water, the chains cold where they lie against her, the tide doing what tides do, coming in with that patient regularity of 6 to 8 waves a minute, each one a little nearer than the last. She could see the whole horizon. She could not turn away from any part of it. Whatever came would come from a direction she was already facing. What comes, in the story as it survives, is Perseus. He found her chained to the rock and learned of her plight. That ordinary phrase in the sources covering a conversation we do not have. A young man asking a question and a young woman answering it, while shackled to a headland. Then the water broke, and the creature emerged from the ocean to devour her, and Perseus killed it. Here the tradition politely refuses to agree with itself. According to one version, Perseus slew the Cetus with the harp, the curved blade lent to him by Hermes, a weapon borrowed from a god, used with the arm, at close range, in the surf. According to another version, he used Medusa's head and turned the sea monster to stone. Two very different deaths. In the first, the monster bleeds. In the second, it never quite finishes arriving. It comes up out of the water and stops there, mid-motion, a hill of stone at the shoreline, where a moment ago there had been an appetite. The sources hold both. Nobody in antiquity felt obliged to choose, and there is no reason for us to choose now, lying here in the dark. A myth can keep two endings the way a coastline keeps two tides. And this was not the only time it happened. Before the Trojan War, Heracles killed a Kêtos to rescue Hesione, the same shape of event on a different shore, with a different hero and a different chained daughter. What the sources flag explicitly is the thing the two stories share underneath. In the Andromeda case and in the Hesione case alike, the ruler annoyed Poseidon. That is the mechanism, not the monster's hunger, which is never explained and never needs to be. The monster is the invoice. Somebody in a palace did something careless with a god of the sea, and the sea sent up a body large enough to be understood without translation. Joseph Eddy Fontenrose noted something further about this Greek beast, and it reaches back further east than the Aegean. He observed that Kêtos was a counterpart of the Tiamat-based Medusa, and was modeled after Yam and Mot and Leviathan, which is to say, the thing that surfaced off the Ethiopian rock was, in his reading, a relative. The Greeks did not invent their sea monster in isolation. They received a shape that had been moving westward along the coasts for a very long time, and gave it a Greek name that meant, more or less, the big one out there. What did they think it looked like? This is where the record becomes wonderfully unsettled, and where you can almost watch people trying to describe something none of them had a fixed image of. It is variously called a sea monster or a sea serpent. Some versions describe a Kêtos with the head of a wild boar or the head of a greyhound, set on the body of a whale or a dolphin, ending in divided, fan-like tails. Take that seriously as a design problem, and it is a strange animal indeed. The blunt, tusked face of a forest pig, or the long, narrow skull of a running dog, mounted on something built entirely for the open water, finishing in tails that spread like a pair of opened hands. It is a composite of land and sea, made by people who knew the land animals intimately and the sea animals only in glimpses, as backs and fins and sudden absences. The sizes given are more specific than you might expect. Seti were said to be colossal beasts, the size of a ship. Their skulls alone measured 40 feet in length, 12 meters, longer than most of the vessels that would have carried the men telling the story. Their spines were a cubit in thickness, the length of a forearm from elbow to fingertip, which is a measurement taken from the body of the person doing the measuring, as almost all old measurements are, and their skeletons stood taller at the shoulder than any elephant. Somebody, at some point, was standing beside bones and reporting dimensions. The numbers have the texture of a thing seen, or at least a thing described by someone who had seen something. In Greek art, though, the Cheti were painted and molded as serpentine fish, long, coiling, ribboned bodies, the kind of shape a brush makes easily on the curve of a pot. The painters and the describers were not obliged to match, and they did not. You could hear about a 40-foot skull and a boar's head at dinner, and then look up at a vase where the same creature ran along the rim like a ribbon of water given a jaw. And not all of the rolls were hostile. This is the part that tends to be forgotten, because a monster is remembered for its worst afternoon. A Kêtos was also portrayed supporting Ino and Melicertes when they threw themselves into the sea, carrying them, holding them up, taking the place of the dolphin that carries Palemon, the same body that arrives to devour a chained girl in one image is, in another image, the thing beneath a mother and child that keeps them from going under. Satyr were also depicted as the mount of a Nereid, one of those very sea daughters whose beauty started all the trouble, seated on the monster's back, riding it across the water the way one rides a horse along a beach. Adversary in one frame, vehicle in the next. The same creature carries two meanings at once, and which one applies depends entirely on whether it is beneath you or in front of you. A pattern that holds wherever people have drawn a monster and still left room on its back for a rider. The Etruscans took that second reading much further. In Etruscan mythology, the Satyr were regarded as psychopomps, conductors of souls, escorts for the dead. They were depicted frequently on sarcophagi and on urns, carved and painted along the stone sides of the containers that held the dead, in the company of dolphins and hippocamps. Picture a small cinerary urn in a chamber tomb, the low light, the smell of cut stone, and running around the box a procession of sea creatures, dolphins arching, seahorses with their curled hindquarters, and among them the great fish serpent with its coiling body, not attacking anyone. Ferrying. The Etruscan deity Nethans is sometimes shown wearing a headdress that depicts a Kêtos, the monster worn on the head of a god, the way a crown is worn, an emblem rather than an enemy, which turns the whole Greek episode inside out. In the Ethiopian story, the sea monster is what stands between a family and its future. On the Etruscan urn, the sea monster is what carries you when there is no future left, the escort of the dead rather than the cause of them. The same creature, a short sail across the water, doing the opposite job. The image kept traveling, and here the record thins into conjecture, which is exactly how it should be told. The art historian John Boardman conjectured that images of the Kêtos in Central Asia influenced depictions of the Chinese dragon and of the Indian Makara. His suggestion was that after contact with Silk Road images of a Kêtos, the Chinese dragon appeared more reptilian and its head shape shifted, and he set that against the earlier pig dragon, which had the head of a boar, in contrast to the reptilian head of dragons as they came to be drawn. That is Boardman's conjecture, offered as a conjecture and not as a settled fact. The evidence is a resemblance between images separated by thousands of miles, and resemblances are suggestive rather than probative. But it is a beautiful thing to imagine. A Greek sea serpent painted on a pot, copied onto something portable, carried east by people who had never seen the Aegean, and slowly changing the face of a dragon on the far side of a continent. The quietest of all the transformations, though, happened not on a trade road, but at a writing desk. And it happened to the word, not to the animal. The Hebrew Bible has its own sea monster, the Tannin. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, in the Septuagint, Tannin was rendered as Kêtos, that same open Greek word for any huge sea monster. When the Greek in turn went into Latin, in the Vulgate, it became Cetus. So the Hebrew monster steps into a Greek word already crowded with Andromeda's beast and the Nereids' mount, and then steps again into Latin. You can watch it happen in a single verse. Genesis 1:21 in the original Hebrew has Tanninim Hagedolim, the great Tanninim, among the creatures made on the fifth day. The Septuagint renders that as Kête to Megala, the great Kête. The Vulgate turns that into Sete Grandia. 3 languages, 1 line, and at each border the creature is handed over to whatever word the receiving language keeps for. Large sea thing. Then Jonah, where the effect becomes visible to everyone. The Hebrew text there does not say Tannin at all. It reads Dag Gadol, literally great fish. Nothing monstrous about it, nothing named, simply a large fish in a book that is not interested in zoology. The Septuagint translates that phrase into Greek as Mega Kêtos. And now the plain great fish is wearing the same Greek word as the beast that came ashore for Andromeda. Jerome, working into Latin, made a careful and rather lovely decision, and then, elsewhere, an inconsistent one. In Jonah he wrote, Piscis grandis, great fish, going back behind the Greek to what the Hebrew actually said. But when he came to the Greek word, Kêtos, in the Gospel of Matthew, at chapter 12, verse 40, where the 3 days in the fish are recalled, he translated it as Cetus. So within one man's Latin Bible, the creature is a great fish in one book and a cetus in another, depending on which language he was translating from at the time. The English versions inherit the split and choose sides. The King James Version has whale. The New International Version returns to the fish. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Neither is a mistranslation, exactly. Both are downstream of that one moment when Dag Gadol was handed the word Kêtos, and the timing of that moment is what gives it its strange gentleness. The Jonah translation came at the start of a period when real whales began to be depicted more widely in Greece, so the word Kêtos was, right then, covering 3 things at once: proven whales, which people were now drawing from observation, sharks, and the old meaning, the curious sea monster of no fixed shape. One word, holding an animal that could be measured, an animal that could be caught, and an animal that could only be feared, without ever announcing which of them it meant on any given page. Nothing was decided. No council ruled that the monster was a whale. The category simply loosened under the word, the way a knot loosens under a steady pull, and a thing that had been sent by an angry god against a coastline became, over a few centuries of copying and rendering and choosing, an animal that swims past ships and breathes and is occasionally hunted. The chained girl, the borrowed blade, the stone body in the surf, all still there in the older layers of the word, quietly, under the whale. The water turns cold now, and the color of it changes with the cold. Salt water of the ordinary kind begins to freeze at about -1.8 degrees, and when it reaches that threshold, the first ice does not arrive as a sheet. It arrives as crystals, scattered across the surface, breaking into small pieces and gathering into flat discs that thicken the water into a suspension the mariners of those latitudes would have known by feel before they knew it by name. In calm weather, that suspension sets into a thin, flat skin, and the skin grows downward as new ice forms beneath it. In rougher water, the discs knock together and ride up over one another's edges until they join into flows. Salt and air stay trapped between the crystals as they lock, so that new ice is far saltier than old, and a year of freezing and thawing rinses most of that salt away again. Into water of that kind, in the early medieval centuries, the Vikings pushed westward across the North Atlantic and reached at last the northeastern fringes of North America. Further east and north, the Novgorodians were sailing the White Sea by the 13th century, and very likely before it. These were working voyages in working weather across a sea that could set solid behind a ship. And around all of it, around every ocean, in the telling, Norse tradition laid a serpent. Jörmungandr is the gigantic sea serpent of Norse mythology, said to encircle the world's oceans. He is named as the second son of the god Loki and the giantess Angrboda. Thor slays him, and that slaying is cited in comparative mythology as a parallel to the Leviathan tradition, standing beside Indra slaying Vritra as another instance of the same ancient shape. That is the whole of what can be responsibly said here. Not because the serpent is small in the tradition, he is the opposite of small, but because the thread of evidence running to this particular table is short, and pulling it further would only be pulling on air. There is a certain rest in that, and it suits the hour. A serpent so large that his body is the boundary of the world does not need embellishment. He is a circle drawn around the water, a way of saying that the ocean has an edge and that the edge is alive. Let him lie there, coiled and unelaborated, while we go looking for something the records will actually let us follow. What the records will let us follow is a creature with several names before it's settled on one. In medieval lore, there appears a sea creature called the Hafgufa. It comes down to us as a name attached to a thing in the water, and the name traveled, which is often what happens to names in the north, where books were few and copied by hand, and quoted by men who had never seen the sea they were describing. The Danish physician and scholar Thomas Bartholin wrote of a cetus called Hafgufa. Christian Franz Paulini wrote of a monstrum marinum, a sea monster, in the flat Latin the learned world then used for anything strange. Carl Linnaeus, who spent his life fixing names to living things so that they would stop drifting, wrote of a genus he called microcosmos, an animal with various other organisms or growths attached to it, comprising a colony, a little world, in other words, a creature that is also a place. Here the caution matters more than the claim. Linnaeus may only indirectly have written about the kraken at all, and the claim that he wrote the word kraken in the margin of a later edition of his great catalogue of nature has never been confirmed. What did happen is simpler and stranger. Subsequent authors, reading backward with a name already in their heads, gathered Bartholin's cetus and Paulini's sea monster and Linnaeus's colony animal and called them all krakens. None of those texts had borne the name when it was written. The name arrived afterward, like a label pasted onto jars already full, and once pasted, it was very difficult to peel off. So the creature we are about to meet was assembled partly out of things that were never it. Its own name enters the written record slowly, and in odd places, and never once in the mouth of somebody who set out to record a monster. The first of the odd places is a voyage home. In 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, returning after formally claiming St. John's, Newfoundland, for England, claimed to have encountered a lion-like monster with glaring eyes. That is his account, and it is worth holding it as exactly that. A claim made by a man on a return crossing in the North Atlantic, with a coastline behind him that England had just written its name across. Lion-like, glaring eyes, not tentacles, not a mountain of flesh, a face in the water, looking back. The second place is a word list. In 1646, the kraken was first described in a Norwegian glossary compiled by Kristen Jensen. Described, that is, not as a discovery, but as a matter of sailors' superstition, the sort of thing a glossary records because working men use the word, and a reader might not know it. There is something quietly moving in that. The monster's earliest attested appearance in writing is lexicographical. Somebody was explaining vocabulary. The third is a book of travels. In 1700, the creature turns up in a travelogue by Francesco Negri, an Italian who had gone north and written down what the north contained. And here the sources leave a small unresolved thing standing, which they make no attempt to tidy. Jensen is first by a century, yet the first description of the kraken is usually credited to the Danish bishop Pontoppidan, writing in 1753. Both statements sit in the record together. Priority and credit have come apart, as they often do, and nobody since has fully put them back. Before the bishop, though, there is a July at sea. In July 1734, Hans Egede, a Dano-Norwegian missionary and explorer, was on a voyage to Godthåb on the western coast of Greenland. What he set down afterward is first-person testimony without independent corroboration, and it reads like a man describing something while still slightly out of breath from having seen it. "A most terrible creature," he wrote, resembling nothing they had seen before. The monster lifted its head so high that it seemed to be higher than the crow's nest on the mainmast. The head was small, the body was short and wrinkled. The unknown creature was using giant fins which propelled it through the water. Later, the sailors saw its tail as well. The monster was longer than their whole ship. Sit with the geometry of that for a moment, because it's the part that stays with you. The mainmast is the tallest thing in the sailor's world. The crow's nest at its top is where a man goes to see further than anyone else aboard. And the head, the small head, on a short, wrinkled body, comes up past it. Everything in the description is proportioned against the vessel, because the vessel is the only ruler they have. Longer than our whole ship, higher than the mast top. That is how sea monsters are measured, always, not in feet, but in ships. Egede himself did not treat the thing as new. He equated it with the Hafgufa of medieval lore, reaching back, as learned men did, to fit an unexplained sight into an inherited category. Much later, in 1999, Ellis suggested that what Egede saw might have been a giant squid. So the chain runs, a sighting matched by the witness to a medieval name, matched by a modern writer to a living animal. Each link is a proposal. Not one of them is a resolved identity. The creature has been renamed twice by people who were not there, and it remains, at the end of that process, exactly as unidentified as it was on the water that July. 19 years later came the bishop. In 1753, Pontoppidan described the kraken as an octopus, a polypus, in his Latin, of tremendous size. He wrote also that it had a reputation for pulling down ships. Hold that phrasing gently, because it is doing careful work. A reputation. He was not reporting a ship pulled down before his eyes. He was reporting what was said of the creature, which is a different order of fact and an honest one. He is telling you what the coast believed, and with the bishop's Polypus, the shape finally sets. Whatever the earlier witnesses had seen, a lion-like face, a small head above the crow's nest, the creature is now a great soft-bodied thing with arms, and it stays that way. It is believed that the legend may have originated from sightings of giant squid, which may grow to 10.5 meters in length, 34 feet of animal, moving in cold water, in an age when nothing had ever been photographed and every account was a sentence. The account draws inward now, away from the creature's size and toward the language that surrounded it. What follows is quieter than what came before, because it is not about the animal at all. It is about the word. The English word kraken, in the sense of the sea monster, comes from Norwegian kraken or krakjen, and both of those are definite forms. Kraken simply means the crake. The name we use for the most fearsome thing in the northern sea is a noun wearing its article, the way a village might speak of the barn or the well, as though there were only one and everyone knew which. So, what is a crake? According to a Norwegian dictionary, the root meaning is a malformed or overgrown, crooked tree. It comes from Old Norse kraki, which is related in turn to Old Norse krukka, literally a hook, the same word that comes into English as crook. The Swedish Academy's Great Dictionary, the Saub, gives essentially the same account for the Swedish word and confirms the lead, kruck, as a diminutive form of krok, hook, or crook in both Norwegian and Swedish, which means that kruk translates roughly and rather sweetly as crookie, a little crooked thing. From that root, the meaning walks outward, the way meanings do, along the paths that daily work wears into them. In time, crake came to mean any severed tree stem or trunk with crooked outgrowths still on it. And because such trunks were useful, the word went with them into the tool shed. Primitive anchors and drags, grapnels, were made from severed spruce tops or from branchy bush trunks, fitted with a stone for a sinker. Those were called crake as well. They were also called krabba in Norwegian, krabba in Swedish, literally crab. Picture the object itself, since it is the hinge of the whole story. A stump of spruce, the side branches cut back to stubs, all of them bending the same way out of a single thick center, and a stone lashed on to carry it down. You throw it over the side, and it catches on the bottom, or it catches on whatever is down there to be caught. It is a hand made of wood, groping in the dark under the boat. In modern Icelandic, Old Norse kraki survives in much the same family of senses: a twig, a drag, but also a pile barrage pole and a boat hook. The Swedish dictionary lists its translations of the Icelandic word plainly: a thin rod with a hook on it, a wooden drag with a stone sinker, a dry spruce trunk with the crooked stripped branches still attached. The kraken, then, is assumed to have been named figuratively, after the crooked tree, or after its descendant, the drag. The Icelandic philologist Finnur Jonsson seems to have been the first to remark on this, notably in 1920. His reasoning is almost tactile. A trunk with crooked outgrowths, and especially a drag, readily conjures up the image of a cephalopod, many limbs from one body, all bending, reaching down. That krabbe also served as a synonym for the monster, only strengthens the pattern, since the crab name too belonged first to the drag. So the great sea monster of the north may be named after a piece of tackle, not after terror, after equipment. Somebody looked over the gunwale at something with many arms and reached for the nearest word, and the nearest word was hanging in the bottom of the boat. Kraken was not the only name it went by either. Early on, the creature answered to several, and the most common, after kraken, was Horven, the Horv. Finnur Jonsson explained that one too, in the same year, as an alternative form of harv, meaning a harrow, and he conjectured that the name was suggested by the inkfish's action of seeming to plough the sea. The image is unhurried and exact. the animal moving just below the surface, dragging its many arms behind it, turning the water the way iron tines turn a field. Both names, then, come from farming and fishing gear. Both take a monster and describe it with a tool. And there is a last turn in the word's life that is stranger than either, because it runs backward. Since the 19th century, crake has given its name to the cephalopod order Octopoda itself, Kraka in Swedish, Kraken in German, so that ordinary, harmless, entirely documented octopuses are now called after the legend. The common octopus, a modest animal you might meet in a rock pool, is named Jättekrake in Swedish, giant kraken. A crooked tree became a drag became a monster. The monster became the scientific family name for the animal that probably inspired it in the first place. The word went out into the dark and came home, carrying the creature with it. There remained one more country for the kraken to travel to, and it was not a country of water. In the 19th century, the French malacologist Denis Montfort became known for his pioneering inquiries into the existence of gigantic octopuses. He was asking, in the language of natural history, the question the fishermen had been asking in the language of tackle: how large can such an animal be? He gathered, argued, pressed the case. The inquiry itself was the innovation, the willingness to treat the giant octopus as a matter for evidence rather than for warning. Then, in 1866, Victor Hugo published Toilers of the Sea, and in it he introduced the pieuvre, the octopus of Guernsey lore, and identified it with the kraken of legend. That is the moment the great man-hunting octopus entered French fiction. Not the moment it entered the sea, or the record, or the fear of sailors. Those were long done. The moment it became a literary property, with a fixed antagonist's role, and a novelist's authority behind the identification. Hugo's move led directly to Jules Verne's Kraken in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, and the sources add one flat qualification to that, which is almost a kindness after so much careful sorting. Verne did not distinguish between octopuses and squids. The most famous sea monster scene in the literature of the deep is written by a man who was not separating the two animals at all, which is where the creature arrives and where it has largely stayed. On the water, it was never one thing. It was a lion-like face with glaring eyes on a homeward crossing, a word in a glossary of sailors' superstition, a paragraph in a traveler's book, a small head above a mainmast off Greenland, a bishop's Polypus with a reputation attached, a name borrowed from a crooked spruce trunk with a stone tied to it. In print it became stable at last, enormous, armed, hostile, unambiguous, which is to say, it acquired a shape in fiction that it had never once held in the sea. The northern water, meanwhile, went on doing what it does, ice forming as crystals and gathering into disks, floes riding over one another in the swell, ships measuring the world against their own masts, because they had nothing else to measure with. And somewhere below all of it, in the dark that sunlight never reaches, the animals themselves, soft, many-armed, indifferent to every name laid upon them, moving through the cold as they had before anyone thought to write a word down. The floor of the sea was once believed to be empty, and it was a book that made it so. In 1854, Edward Forbes published Distribution of Marine Life, and in it he argued that no life could exist below about 600 meters. Beneath 2,000 feet, he reasoned, the water held nothing, no shell, no fin, no creeping thing. It was a tidy idea, and for a while it was a comfortable one. The deep had a lid on it. Whatever lay under that lid was cold, dark, sterile water, and a sailor's imagination could stop there without needing to furnish the rooms below. 14 years later, the lid came off. In 1868, the British biologists W. B. Carpenter and C. Wyville Thomson went dredging, hauling weighted iron frames along the seabed and drawing the mud up over the rail, and found the deep water full of living things. There is something quietly moving about how ordinary the method was. No revelation, no apparition rising alongside the hull, simply a heavy net, a long rope, and the patience to keep letting it down until the water gave up what it held. Forbes had been wrong, and the correction arrived as sediment in a tray. Wyville Thomson went further. From 1872 to 1876, he served as chief scientist aboard the Challenger expedition, a voyage of 4 years that effectively created the science of oceanography, a discipline built out of soundings and samples and the slow accumulation of numbers written in a ledger while the ship rolled. Before that voyage, the ocean floor was chiefly a matter of opinion. After it, there were measurements. The instruments kept reaching lower. In 1898 and 1899, in the southern Atlantic, Carl Chun sailed aboard the Valdivia and brought many new life forms to the surface from depths of over 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet of water above them, and each creature arriving in air it had never met. Yet all of this was still retrieval rather than sight. Nobody had watched a deep-sea animal in the place where it actually lived. That came in 1930, when William Beebe and Otis Barton were lowered by cable into the sea inside a sphere of steel called the bathysphere. They went down 434 meters, 1,424 feet, sealed in a ball of metal with a small window, breathing their own air, hanging from a wire. There, for the first time, human eyes made observations of deep-sea animals in their natural environment, rather than in a net or on a deck. Think of the strangeness of that view. Red light already absorbed in the top few meters, yellow and green gone below that, only blue and violet still traveling down through the cold, and then the last of the blue failing too. If you have ever lain in a dark room and felt the darkness as a texture rather than an absence, you have some small sense of the medium they were looking into. Descent continued in slow, extraordinary steps. In 1960, the self-powered submersible Trieste developed by Jacques Piccard, carried Piccard and Don Walsh to the deepest part of Earth's oceans, the Mariana Trench in the Pacific, a trench that runs for some 2,500 kilometers across the seabed near a volcanic archipelago in the West Pacific. They reached about 10,915 meters, nearly 7 miles beneath the surface, and the seafloor there was mud and quiet and pressure. In 2006, a diver of the US Navy set a new record for an atmospheric diving suit, descending to 2,000 feet, 610 meters, inside an articulated, pressurized shell that kept his body at the ordinary weight of air while the ocean pressed on the metal instead of on him. The Trieste feat was not repeated until 2012, when James Cameron piloted the Deep-Sea Challenger to similar depths. And what the descents found down there was not emptiness at all, and not exactly a monster either. Around deep-sea hydrothermal vents, where mineral-rich water rises out of the seabed, whole communities live without any sunlight whatsoever. Their primary producers are sulfide-oxidizing chemoautotrophic bacteria, life that eats chemistry rather than light. Around them cluster specialized bivalves, sea anemones, barnacles, crabs, worms and fish, many of them found nowhere else on Earth. Elsewhere on the floor, the detritivores wait for organic material to fall from above. Then there is the whale. A dead whale sinking to the bottom of the ocean provides food for an entire assembly of organisms, which likewise rely largely on the actions of sulfur-reducing bacteria. A single body, coming slowly down through a mile of black water, feeds a settlement that lasts and lasts, and many new microbes and other life forms have been discovered in those places. The literal fact turns out to have the shape of the old story. An enormous body arrives from the dark, and a community forms around it. Bodies also come the other way, upward and inward, onto beaches. Sea monster corpses have been reported since recent antiquity, and unidentified ones acquired a name of their own, globsters. The word suits them. They arrive on the tide line as a mass rather than as an animal, and whatever they were is no longer legible in what remains. In 1977, the Japanese trawler Zuio Maru hauled up something off New Zealand that looked, in the photographs, like a plesiosaur, a long neck, small head, flippers, the silhouette from a geology textbook, lifted dripping out of a net. It caused a sensation. It was immortalized on a Brazilian postage stamp, which is a peculiar kind of immortality, a creature that may never have existed, gummed and perforated and franked. Then the FBI suggested the carcass was the decomposing body of a basking shark, and the plesiosaur went back into the drawer it had come from. In August 2001, an alleged sea monster washed up on Newfoundland, and this time the answer arrived through DNA testing, which confirmed it was a sperm whale. In July 2003, a strange creature came ashore at Los Muermos on the Chilean seashore, and the first descriptions called it a mammoth jellyfish as long as a bus, a phrase that tells you exactly how little shape the thing had, since a jellyfish and a bus have nothing in common but volume. It too was later determined to be the corpse of a sperm whale, and in May 2017, The Guardian published an article claiming a giant sea monster's corpse had been found in Indonesia, along with an alleged photograph of it. The claim and the photograph both belong to the reader's judgment rather than to the record. These cases, the Chilean shore, the Indonesian claim, and the others scattered across the record, do converge on a single explanation. The answer to all of them is the same answer. Sperm whales that die at sea decompose in a particular way. The blubber detaches from the body, and what floats free is a featureless whitish mass. No head, no jaw, no fin, nothing to hold the eye and say, "Animal." Sometimes these masses show a hairy texture because strands of collagen fibers have been exposed and stand out from the surface like coarse, pale wool. So the boneless, amorphic globster, once believed by some to be a gigantic octopus, is a whale coming apart. Not a creature with no bones, but a creature whose bones have gone elsewhere. What washes up is the outer garment, the Zuio Maru. Analysis revealed a comparable phenomenon in decomposing basking sharks. They lose most of the lower head area first, and the dorsal and caudal fins go early too. Remove those from a shark, and the remaining shape is a small head on a long neck, a body, and paired fins, a plesiosaur, near enough, drawn in the negative by whatever the sea has already taken away. Decay is not random. It follows the softest tissue first, and in following it, it carves. That single mechanism dissolves a great many stories, and yet not all of them, and the proposed origins for sightings have been set out in something like an order. Some sea monsters may have been based on scientifically accepted creatures, whales, and types of giant and colossal squid, animals that are genuinely enormous and genuinely there. Cryptozoologists suggest something bolder, that modern-day sea monsters are surviving specimens of giant marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs from the Jurassic and Cretaceous, or extinct whales such as Basilosaurus, still swimming somewhere unvisited. Ship damage from tropical cyclones, hurricanes and typhoons has also been proposed as a possible origin. A vessel returns splintered, stove in along one flank, and the crew must account for what struck her in the dark. In 1892, Anthony Cornelis Aldermans, then director of the Royal Zoological Gardens at The Hague, saw the publication of his book, The Great Sea Serpent, in which he suggested that many sea serpent reports were best accounted for by a previously unknown giant, long-necked pinniped, a seal grown vast and long in the neck, unremarked by science, but present in the water. It is a wonderfully sober proposal, and you can feel in it the shape of a man trying to keep faith with the witnesses while keeping faith with zoology. And beneath all of these sits the plainest explanation of all. It is likely that many reports are misinterpreted sightings of shark and whale carcasses, floating kelp, logs or other flotsam, abandoned rafts, canoes, fishing nets, a tangle of net rolling on a swell at half a mile's distance, in poor light, from a moving deck, is a shape with no name. And a shape with no name does not stay nameless for long, because sailors have to write something in the log, which brings the whole long argument to a place in North Dakota, more than 1,000 miles from any coast, where the naming ran the other way for once. In 2015, an American fossil collector named Deborah Shepard was revisiting a public fossil dig site near the town of Walhalla when she uncovered an isolated bone fragment, a single piece weathering out of the rock. The rock itself was a bentonite layer of the Pembina member of the Pierre Shale, radiometrically dated to about 80 million years, 80.04 million, with a margin of about 100,000 years, which is a remarkable thing to be able to say about a Tuesday's worth of digging. That shale was seabed once. The prairie there is the floor of a vanished ocean, lifted and dried and planted with wheat. Shepard reported her discovery to a park ranger, and the report traveled onward to Clint Boyd, senior paleontologist of the North Dakota Geological Survey, who then led a volunteer excavation of the site. Fieldwork continued through 2018, 3 more seasons of people kneeling in shale with brushes and picks, and recovered the rest of the animal, a nearly complete but disarticulated skull, missing only the brain case, the parietal bone, the scleral rings, and parts of the nose, all 7 cervical vertebrae, 5 dorsal vertebrae, 11 ribs, and further bones that remain unprepared to this day, still wrapped, still waiting their turn. Boyd nicknamed the specimen Georgie. It was accessioned into the collections of the North Dakota Heritage Center under the catalog number NDGS 10838, which is the modern equivalent of writing a creature's true name in a ledger so that it can always be found again. The fossils were described in detail by the American paleontologist Amelia Zietlow, working with Boyd and with Nathan Van Vranken, and the study was published in 2023. Their reading of the animal changed along the way. The team initially considered the specimen to represent the oldest known occurrence of Mosasaurus. Further preparation revealed anatomical features showing that it belonged instead to a distinct mosasaurid sitting between Mosasaurus and the more basal Cledastes. A high tooth count like the one, a squared-off quadrate bone like the other. The skull measures 72 centimeters in total length. The lower jaw is 80.8 centimeters. From those figures, the describers estimated a whole animal of roughly 5 to 7 meters, a medium-sized marine lizard, large enough to be the largest thing in a bay and small enough to be eaten by something else. Not everyone agrees on the name. The Canadian paleontologist Michael Caldwell, speaking to the New York Times, argued that the taxon is more likely a new species of Cledastes, in which case it would be called Cledastes walhallaensis. Instead, Zietlow and her colleagues hold that the anatomical differences are sufficient to warrant a genus of its own. The disagreement is entirely ordinary. and it rhymes with something much older, the way a creature can survive in the record, chiefly as an argument between the people describing it. There is one more detail in the bones. The fourth dorsal vertebra carries traces that probably represent bite marks. They show no signs of healing, so they were made either right before the animal died or sometime afterwards in a single biting event. The timing cannot be settled. The describers argued the marks are consistent with those made by mosasaurs and not with those made by sharks, and that the trace maker may have consumed the back portion of the skeleton, which would explain why the rest of the body was separated from what was found. A monster, if you like the word, eaten by another monster 80 million years before anyone had the word at all. And then the names. The species name, Walhallaensis, honors the city of Walhalla, where the bone fragments surfaced. The city's name derives from Valhalla, the hall of slain warriors in Norse tradition. That Norse thread, once noticed, suggested the generic name in turn. Jormungandr, after the serpent said to encircle the world's oceans, so the sequence runs cleanly in one direction and only one. A myth names a town on the northern plains. The town names a fossil found in its shale, and the fossil, carrying that name into the scientific literature, walks the serpent back into speech, printed now in a journal, catalogued in a museum drawer, still in the mouth of anyone who reads the label aloud. Which returns us to the word itself and to the question that has been waiting underneath all of this. Monster comes from the Latin monstrum, and monstrum comes from moneo, to remind, to warn, to instruct, to foretell. Long before it meant a thing with teeth, it meant a sign, something strange or singular, contrary to the usual course of nature, by which notice is given. Read that way, what people set beneath their ships was less often a predator than a notice that sunlight reaches only the upper layers, and that the greater part of the ocean lies in permanent darkness. A notice that a body of water covering some 71% of the world was never ours, and never became ours, no matter how many keels crossed it. The warning was accurate. It simply arrived in the only form that could be carried home and repeated at a fire. A shape, a size, a name. And the category held whatever a people needed it to hold, because the definition of a monster is subjective and always has been. The same word covered a Babylonian mother of waters, who is as clearly the parent of the gods as she is the parent of anything monstrous. It covered a servant of a Canaanite sea god, surviving in a broken tablet as an epithet and a doubt. It covered two dangers set within an arrow's range of each other in a narrow channel, so that avoiding one meant approaching the other. It covered a great fish that became a whale by passing through 3 languages. It covered a crooked tree, a drag hauled up from a fjord, a mass of pale blubber on a beach at dawn. And in one telling from the southeastern coast of Alaska, It covered Gunakadate, who brought prosperity and good luck to a starving village, a monster whose whole function was to feed people who could not feed themselves. So the monster is the shape a people gives to what it cannot see, not a failure of knowledge, but a way of holding knowledge before instruments existed to hold it. A placeholder with a face, put into the water so that the water would not be featureless. And naming it was itself a kind of seamanship, as practical as caulking a hull, as necessary as a sounding line. You cannot steer around a blankness, you can steer around a name. Let the sea keep its dark and its distance now. There is nothing left in it that needs your watching. Imagine the dark and salted deep far behind you, its cold weight no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door onto the sea, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the old serpents and their many names in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.